Okay, so in this lecture, I'm going to talk about a subject matter that is kind of near and dear to my heart, which is animal behavior and behavioral ecology. That is kind of my field of expertise. So let's take a survey through some different aspects of behavior. So the article from that relates to animal behavior, this was an article from last year on caterpillars, which develop into butterflies, as you know. And so oftentimes when we think about butterflies, the situation is that a particular butterfly will lay their eggs on only one specific species of plant, their host plant. And that's the plant where the caterpillars will grow and consume the leaves and eventually metamorphosize into a butterfly. But in this study, they were looking at for some species of butterflies, they actually can change their host plant species. So you can get butterflies that, change the odor of the plant that they prefer. And this preference can be transmitted to their offspring through social learning. So it's something that the caterpillars will learn from associating with the butterflies. So we're going to talk about a few concepts related to animal behavior. The first thing we're going to discuss is kind of just how to be an animal behaviorist. So how can you turn observations of behavior into data, which you could run statistics on? And then we're going to look at the difference between proximate and ultimate explanations, proximate and ultimate questions, and then how behavior can develop. So the concept of genetic components versus different types of learning. And then we're going to look at a few specific types of behavior, so orientation behavior, and then lastly, altruistic behavior. And there's the textbook chapter that deals with behavior. So when you study animal behavior, you're looking at the actions that animals take, so what they do, how this behavior develops, and then adaptive consequences of this behavior. So how does a particular behavior affect the fitness of the organism that carries it out? And if these experiments and observations are done in kind of a laboratory setting, removed from their natural habitat, usually this is referred to as animal behavior. And if you do experiments in the field, so looking at the behavior of an animal in context with its normal environment, usually that's referred to as behavioral ecology. So part of the job of being an animal behaviorist is to make observations about what animals do and turn those observations into scientific data, which means mathematical data. So this is kind of an important question, because if you just observe an animal doing their actions, it's not always necessarily clear how you could turn those observations into numerical data. You'll just see, a target animal doing certain things in their environment. So how do you transform those observations into numerical data? So one good way to understand this process is just to try it out. So I'm going to show you a couple videos of animals behaving in a certain fashion, and I want you to make observations of what you see. So try to observe these videos carefully and record kind of like the most important events that you see. So here's an interaction involving two monitor lizards in Thailand.
Management, not a computer. Yes. I didn't think they. Oh! Ah! Oh, look. You had some blood on his nose. He has.
Okay, so there was an interaction between two lizards. So I want you to kind of think about what you observed. So what exactly happened in this video? So I've tried to compile a list of objective observations of what happened. So there were 2 monitor lizards in this video, and for the purposes of a scientific study, you would want to give names or labels to these individuals. You can keep track of them. So you could call them monitors A and B. So A is the monitor that started off with the fish in his or her mouth. I'm not sure just by looking at the monitors if they're male or female. They don't look that different. They don't have really strong sexual dimorphism. And then monitor lizard B approached from A's right side and grabbed fish with his or her jaws. And that was what they were holding in their jaws was a fish. They were locked together for a few seconds. You could time this if you wanted to know exactly how long they were both holding on to the fish. While they were held together like this, the monitor A's claws were raised close to B's face. B pulled the fish away and started to consume it. A stayed in place. So those were some objective observations. I think that if someone else watched the same video, they would agree that those events took place. It's important when you're being an animal behaviorist to report behavior as objective observations. So you're not guessing about emotions or intent or anything like that. And that's not to say that other animals don't have emotions and don't have intent and don't have internal dialogue or thoughts or motivations, because they do. But from the outside, it's often difficult to know exactly how an individual animal is feeling and what they're thinking. So the best way to make sure that everyone kind of agrees on observations is to make your observations objective, to remove from it insinuations about emotions and intent. So okay observations would be, you could talk about the positions of the 2 lizards relative to each other. You could define terms for body and leg posture, like a leg being raised or lowered, etc. You could time behaviors, so how long did each behavior take? How long were the 2 lizards pulling on the fish? So sometimes animals will carry out behaviors, the same type of behavior over and over and over again. So a lot of times you can define that as, okay, I'm going to say I'm calling this type of behavior, like, pulling behavior or territorial behavior. And this is how I'm defining it, is that when you see these specific behavioral actions, I'm calling it that behavior. But everything has to be defined clearly and objectively. So not okay observations would be lizard B was a bastard, lizard A was a coward and afraid of lizard B was angry and dominant and a bully. It's possible that these are true, but not everyone will agree on those assessments, and those are subjective assessments. So for that reason, we want to make sure our observations are objective. That if you gave 100 people the chance to observe the same video, they would come away and agree on these assessments of the behavior, these observations. So to understand this behavior further, like this interaction between the 2 monitor lizards, there's always some follow-up questions that would be important to investigate. So you might want to know, what sexes were lizards A and B? Were they closely related? Did they live together for a long time prior to this event? Or were these strangers, monitor lizard strangers to each other? If you watched these 2 lizards for many years, would this event repeat itself? Would B end up taking food from A that A originally started with? So for this particular species of monitor lizard, does this event happen often? Is the outcome of the event, who ends up with the food, related to the sex of the individuals or their size or age? Is it related to the food type? Do certain types of food cause this type of behavior more often, of one lizard taking food from another, and some food does not instigate this type of behavior? So those are all follow-up questions that would be good to investigate to understand this behavior further. Here's a squirrel video. This is one of my videos from the field. You can see the California ground squirrel, which was my study species. So let's see what happens in this video. Again, try to make some nice objective observations of what you see. All right, so what exactly happened in this video? Well, here's some observations that I made. The ground squirrel was eating food. This was actually horse feed that I put out to try to attract the ground squirrels to make observations of their behavior. This was early on before I figured out exactly what my research study was going to be. So at this point, I was just bringing ground squirrels to a certain place so I could kind of observe them and try and think about what my experimental setup, my experimental design could be. So the squirrel did eat a specific amount of food. If you wanted to, you could weigh the food before and after to figure out exactly how much food the ground squirrel consumed, if that was your interest. The squirrel looked up 2 times during this video clip. The first time was for 1.5 seconds. The second time was for 26 seconds. Overall, the ground squirrel spent 8.6 seconds eating food and 27.5 seconds looking up. So you can break this up in terms of percentage. So how much, kind of like what percent of the time available to the squirrel did they allocate towards consuming food, which was 24% for this video, versus how much time did they allocate for looking up, which you could call vigilance behavior. In this case, it was 76% of the time. The squirrel also took 2 steps forward during the video. Okay, so that was a set of objective observations we made of the ground squirrels based on that video. Let's say that you observed something else regarding these ground squirrels. There's a hawk, flying in the sky, and when the hawk gives off a call, you notice that the ground squirrels look up. So you've observed this. Maybe you've observed this several times, so you're pretty sure that there is a definite correlation between the 2 events, that when there's a hawk call, pretty soon after, ground squirrels in the area look up. So you could ask some questions about this squirrel behavior. You could say, what neural pathways are involved in the connection between hearing the hawk call and producing the behavior of looking up? You could say, how specific is this response to hawk calls? Will it work for calls for many hawk species? Does the behavior have to be learned? If so, how is it normally learned? There's different processes of learning. So what is the normal way that the squirrels learn this behavior? What genes are involved in producing the behavior? If there's some type of genetic predisposition for this behavior, what genes are involved? So you can see all of these questions kind of share a similar theme. They're about how the behavior happens, how it develops, how does it actually occur in the body of the ground squirrel. So these how questions are referred to as proximate questions. So here we're not exactly concerned with the effect of the behavior or why the behavior is going on. We're interested in how the behavior happens. Those are proximate questions. You could ask another set of questions about the same behavior of the squirrels looking up when they hear hawk calls. You could say, what is the function of this behavior? How does looking up benefit the squirrels by increasing their survival and/or reproduction? Do squirrels that react this way, that look up in response to hawk calls, do they survive more often than those that do not have this behavior? What is the evolutionary history of this behavior? What kind of evolutionary forces, in this case probably mostly natural selection, were involved in producing this behavior? You could say, do other related species of squirrels have the same behavior? So do they all exhibit this behavior of looking up in response to hawk calls? And that would also tell you more about, when exactly this behavior evolved, the evolutionary history of it. So these questions are primarily concerned with why the behavior happens. So why did it show up? Why did it evolve? What's the function of the behavior? How it affects fitness? That's this field of questions, and these are called ultimate questions. They're why the behavior occurs. So let's do some more practice on the difference between proximate and ultimate questions. So let's say I'm doing a food choice experiment using turtles. So I'm giving a turtle a choice between lettuce and cabbage. So basically you put an animal in a little arena. On one side is one food type lettuce, the other side is cabbage. Then you release the turtle in the middle. Maybe you show them both of the food items to start with, and then you just measure, which food do they consume more, or which food do they go to over a certain time period. So in this experiment, the turtle chooses the cabbage. So you could ask, what chemicals in the cabbage is the turtle attracted to? So here we're interested in specifically kind of this physiological response. So what taste receptors are there in the turtle that would kind of react with specific chemicals in the cabbage? So in this question, we're asking how this behavior happens. So the mechanism of the behavior. So that would be a proximate question. You could say, does having preference for certain foods allow turtles to eat more energy-rich foods and achieve a greater body weight? So here you can see we're asking about the reason for the preference. So kind of the adaptive consequences of having a preference for cabbage. So that would be an ultimate question. You could say, do turtles use their eyes or smell to identify different types of food? Here again, we're interested in the mechanism of the behavior, how exactly it operates. So that would be a proximate question. You could say, can turtles detect specific chemicals present in leaves? Again, we're not really talking about the function of the behavior, we're just interested in how exactly it happens, what chemicals in the leaves does the turtle detect, so that would be another proximate question. Lastly, you could say, did taste evolve in turtles to avoid toxins? So here we're interested in the evolutionary history of taste, as well as the function of taste to avoid poisons in their environment. So that would be an ultimate question. Hopefully that's all made sense to you so far. Let's do a few more examples just to make sure you're kind of understanding it, the difference between proximate and ultimate. So let's say you're watching a male mockingbird sing a song in the direction of a female mockingbird. You could ask, what frequency of sound waves is the male's song? So here we're describing the behavior, we're describing the sound waves in kind of a mathematical fashion. We're trying to understand the behavior, but just kind of the behavior's characteristics at it as it is without looking at the reason for it. So that would be a proximate question. You could say, do males with more complicated songs have more success mating with females? Here we're talking about the relationship between the behavior and fitness, reproductive success. So that's an ultimate question. What genes are involved in bird singing? So here we're interested in the development of the behavior, how it develops. That's a proximate question. If you say, do male birds learn how to sing, or is it genetically hardwired? Again, that's the development of the behavior. That's proximate. You could say, how does the mockingbird song differ from the songs of other closely related species? So this one's a little bit trickier, but here we're talking about comparing it to closely related species. So what we're really getting into here is the evolution of song. So kind of like how the song has changed through evolutionary time. So that is an ultimate question. So hopefully that's helped you to go through some examples of proximate and ultimate questions. So now let's take a look at how behaviors develop. And so every behavior you look at has a genetic and an environmental component. I kind of talked about this already when I discussed genetics, but any behavior you would look at would have a basis of the behavior that is genetic, based on genes, and an environmental component. Even a behavior that is entirely learned requires a brain in order to carry out that behavior typically. And the genes provide blueprints on building the brain. Oftentimes, there's particular parts of the brain that are receptive to signals from the environment to learn behavior. They might be that there's a certain time period in the development of the animal where these parts of the brain are flexible and can pick up on behavior, like learning a language. So this capacity to learn a language or to carry out a behavior is part of the genes, the genetic instructions of the animal. And even a behavior that's genetically hardwired, that doesn't have to be learned, will not actually show up unless you have a nurturing environment during development. So you could say, you have the behavior of crawling. Like humans are genetically hardwired to crawl, but if babies and embryos don't have a nurturing environment in the womb, then they may not develop normally. They may not actually develop the capacity to crawl. So even a genetically hardwired behavior requires a specific nurturing environment in order to show up. But saying that you cannot have a completely genetically hardwired behavior or a completely, environmental behavior, some behaviors are more inflexible, more genetically determined, and others are highly flexible and have to be learned. So they fall on a spectrum. So let's look at some examples of behavior on this spectrum. Let's start with behaviors that have a strong genetic component that you could refer to as genetically hardwired, even with the caveat that although they're genetically hardwired, they would not show up unless there is a normal nurturing environment during development. So moths have evolved ultrasonic ears, which are called tympani. You can see here in the diagram with the arrow pointed to it, located kind of behind their wings. And these these tympani are used specifically to pick up on the echolocation calls of bats. So they've evolved hearing specifically to deal with the danger represented by predatory bats. So when moths hear the echolocation calls, they have specific behavior that they carry out that they don't have to learn. The first part of this behavior is they fly away from the direction of the echolocation calls. So they can tell what direction the echolocation calls come from, and they'll fly away from it. If the bat gets really close, which they can sense because the amplitude, the volume of the echolocation calls would get very high, then they switch to another behavioral tactic by just turning off their flight muscles and just dropping out of the sky. That's a last ditch effort to get away from the bat by basically saying, okay, I'm going to take my chances by just free falling and then hopefully getting away from the bat that way. This behavioral strategy doesn't have to be learned. So the moths would be born with these behavioral abilities coded into their bodies. Let's take a look at it in this video.
Once the prey is in range, the bat locks onto the target and homes in for the kill. But this moth can hear what's coming. Its ears are specifically tuned to the bat's sound search system. The moth's ears are simple pits just above its legs, hidden under its fur. The bat's shrieks vibrate the moth's eardrums, triggering a reflex action of nerve impulses, which fire straight into the wing muscles. As the bat closes in, it squeals higher and faster, and the moth's wings react, changing its flight path to duck out of danger. So the moth's life is saved by a dramatic nosedive, switched on entirely by sound.
Okay, so let's see some other examples of genetically hardwired behaviors. Fruit flies have been studied a lot for their genes, and a lot of their behaviors are genetically hardwired by particular genes, including courtship behavior. So courtship behavior in fruit flies is influenced by a specific gene, which is called the gender blind gene, or GB. So if there's a mutation in this gene, that causes male fruit flies to become bisexual, to equally court male and female fruit flies. A mutation of another gene called the fruitless gene causes females to act like a courting male and attempt to court females. So on the right here you can see in this picture it's a female courting another female. So for fruit flies, their courtship behavior is relatively simple and based on a lot of these genes. As mammals, we also have strongly genetically hardwired behaviors that you could often refer to as instincts that we are born with. So for example, baby mammals have a sucking reflex. If you put a finger or an object in the roof of the mouth of a baby, they'll suck on it, and that's to make them better at breastfeeding. So if a baby has a nipple that touches the roof of the mouth, they'll start sucking on the nipple and get milk that way. They don't have to learn this. They are born with this ability, and that helps them feed effectively. So humans have this, as do other mammals as well. Babies also have a number of other instincts. So they have a grasping instinct that if you kind of move a baby down quickly like they're falling, they'll grab, trying to grab onto something. If you touch their hand with your finger, they'll grab onto it with their hand. So those, babies are born with a lot of behaviors that they don't have to learn. But some behaviors do have to be learned. There are several types of learning, including classical conditioning, operant conditioning, which is also called trial and error learning, and then social or observational learning. So let's start with classical conditioning. And a lot of this terminology goes back to a researcher called Pavlov, which maybe you've heard of before. He did a number of experiments using different types of animals. I think he did research on pigeons, but also dogs, pairing stimuli with each other. So in classical conditioning, an animal makes an association between something that was previously neutral, that they previously wouldn't respond to, and something that's meaningful. So you can kind of think of it, in classical conditioning, you have an animal kind of sitting back and observing their environment, and they're connecting two things. They're connecting something that's important with something that they didn't consider to be important before, but they're connecting the two. So an example of this would be one of the likely mechanisms by which, the ground squirrels that I studied learn to respond to bird calls, in this case, California quail alarm calls. I don't know exactly that this is how it happened, but this is a probable mechanism. So let's see how classical conditioning would apply in the case of learning to respond to a novel alarm call. So before conditioning, we're talking about young squirrels that didn't really have experience with quail calls. If a squirrel heard a quail alarm call, they wouldn't respond. So you could get a quail alarm call like this. But the response of the ground squirrels would be, who cares? Why should they respond to this call from a quail? So that's before conditioning. But then the squirrel hears the quail alarm call that I just played for you, and at the same time, they see a predator, in this case, a bobcat. So they're hearing this quail alarm call coming in, and at the same time, they're seeing something that they know is threatening, which is the bobcat. So the squirrel will run away to their burrow in response to the bobcat. But it's important that they got these two stimuli paired together. If they hear this over and over and over again, so if they continue to hear the quail alarm call in combination with seeing or hearing or smelling a predator, then they will start to associate these with each other. They'll associate the quail alarm call with the presence of a predator. So in their brain, they'll make this connection. They'll say, quail alarm call equals a predator's nearby. So this is the conditioning part of the process. So after conditioning, after learning this relationship, making this connection between quail alarm calls and predators, if the squirrels hear the quail alarm call by itself, with no predators nearby, none to observe, they will run away just in response to the quail alarm call because they've associated it with the presence of a predator. So they hear the quail alarm call and the response is, a predator's nearby, run dude run. And the reason why I know that something like this took place is because this is what I did. I went out into the field and played quail alarm calls, and there was no predator. There was no bobcat, and yet the squirrels ran away in response to the quail alarm calls. So something like this likely happened. The squirrels made this association between the bird alarm calls and a predator. Here's some other examples of classical conditioning, just to give you more context of how classical conditioning would happen with wild animals. So coyote searching for water and finally found it in the form of a river. This is a young coyote. He hasn't had that much experience. So now he hears the sound of the rushing river and drinks the water, and so he's connecting the two. He's saying, aha, if I hear this rushing sound, that means that there's water. So he'll seek out that sound when he's thirsty. In this case, you have a baby antelope that hears a loud new sound that she hadn't experienced before, a lion's roar, and at the same time she spots a lion in the distance. So she's already afraid of the sight of a lion, but she didn't know what the lion sounded like. So now she's associating the sound of the lion's roar with a lion. So if she hears it, she'll know a lion's nearby. Let's say a butterfly visits a large yellow flower, finds it has a lot of delicious nectar, and then he visits a small blue flower that has very little nectar. So he learns that large yellow flowers are good and associates them with high amounts of nectar, and he associates small blue flowers with being bad, with not having a lot of nectar. Okay, so we've talked a lot about classical conditioning. Now let's discuss another type of learning, which is operant conditioning or trial and error learning. In this case, so the difference here between operant conditioning and classical conditioning is, remember when I talked about classical conditioning, the animal's kind of sitting back and observing their environment and making connections. In operant conditioning, that's not going on. The animal is actively doing something, and they're learning to make connections between their actions and positive or negative consequences. So it's all based on what the animal actually does. Whereas in classical conditioning, they don't have to do anything. They're just making connections between what they observe externally. So in operant conditioning, animal does something. If the action results in positive consequences, like food or water or competitive success or reproduction, then they will remember to keep doing this action. If the action has negative consequences, like damages them or pain or they lose territory, they'll remember to avoid this action in the future. So that's why it's also called trial and error learning. They try stuff out to see what works and what doesn't work. So an example of this would be if you're training your dog or cat to do a trick. So they learn that when they carry out a specific action, they get a reward. So they're going to remember how to do that trick. And they'll do that trick more and more because they've associated with, when they do this trick, they get a positive benefit, a treat. So let's say you decide to train your cat to say mama. So you try and get your cat to copy you saying mama, you say mama, and if the cat's meow sounds a little bit like mama, then you give them a treat. So the cat learns that when he meows like that, when he makes this probably really horrific meow that doesn't sound very good in their own language, he gets a treat. So he learns to meow mama. And so this is a real video of someone that had a lot of time on their hands, and they decided to teach their cat to say mama.
Say mama. Mama.
Okay, so that's operant conditioning. Operant conditioning can also take the form of play behavior. So if you think about it, when animals engage in play, including humans, you have small baby animals or young animals, and they're trying to figure out what works. They're trying out behaviors that they would use as an adult to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So when animals play fight with each other, as you'll see in this video with young bears, they're trying to figure out what fighting moves are effective, which ones are not as effective. They're not engaged in real bouts where they'll be seriously hurt, but they're learning. So they'll learn, if I do this, then the other bear that I'm fighting with can pretty easily, flip me over and I'll be vulnerable. So I won't do that move again. If I do this move, then I tend to win in these fake contests. So they'll learn to do that behavior in the future. So let's take a look at this play fighting with these young bears.
Time out. No? On 5.
So here are some other examples of operant conditioning to give you some more stories of how operant conditioning would happen in like a wild setting. So we have peacock spiders. You have a male peacock spider on the left. He's attempting to figure out the best way to dance to impress the ladies. So he tries this move where he raises his legs high up above his head, and the female spiders love that move. So he has a lot of success with ladies when he does that move. So he learns to raise his legs during his dance. Here's another example. So you have a baby fish that's swimming quickly through a coral reef, and she ends up banging her side against a rock, injuring herself. She learns that when she swims close to rocks, she needs to swim slowly and carefully. So she had this negative consequence, getting injured, and as a result, she's more careful in the future. So here we have a baby raccoon that gets too close to a skunk and gets sprayed. And he learns that he needs to keep his distance around skunks. You could think of this in terms of classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So for classical conditioning, this baby raccoon didn't know ahead of time that the skunk would be an animal that would spray them. So he's making a classical association between the side of the skunk and this spraying ability. But he's also learning by operant conditioning that he has to keep his distance around skunks, that he got sprayed pretty badly when he was close, so he'll learn to keep his distance in the future. So then we come to social or observational learning. So in this case, an animal learns to do something by observing a conspecific, a member of the same species. Often this involves a smaller, younger individual mimicking or copying the actions of an older, experienced individual. So the important point here is that the animal is copying something even if they're not receiving information at that point that this behavior is useful or that it'll help them function in the environment. They are just open to copy the behavior of older individuals. And this is very common in humans. So learning to speak a language, being taught something by demonstration. So someone saying, copy what I'm doing, I'm going to show you how to use this tool. Then you are learning by social or observational learning. And the presence of social or observational learning, this allows for culture, for cultural non-genetic transmission of traits within a population. So you don't just have biological transmission of traits. You don't just have, genes getting passed down from generation to generation. You also have culture, cultural ideas that pass down from one generation to the next. And this is made possible by the existence of this type of social learning. So culture is very important for humans. We have a lot of cultural transmission, but it's not unique to humans. So there are a lot of other cases of other animals that have culture and cultural transmission of ideas. So let's take a little survey through cultural social learning in other animals. So in general, for most birds, their songs are not genetically programmed. They have to learn their songs. And usually, male birds will learn their songs by listening to their fathers. So they'll copy the songs of their fathers. And as in humans, you have cultural isolation that produces different bird dialects within a species. So first, let's take a look at this video of a male zebra finch attempting to impress a female finch with his song. Okay. And then to show you the difference between dialects, let's listen to a couple of songs. This is from the same species of bird, the white-crowned sparrow, but these are different dialects from different regions in their range. So first I'll play you the song of this sparrow from the Oregon coast. And here's their song from a population in Seattle. Oregon coast and Seattle. So a little bit different in the shape of the call, the frequency. So these are different dialects, different versions of kind of the same basic song. Here's another example of social learning. So in the recent past, just kind of like, maybe a few decades ago, you had a bottlenose dolphin off the coast of Australia. And this is probably a female dolphin who discovered this, but she discovered how to use sponges as hunting tools. So what they do is they basically take the sponge to the bottom of the ocean and they use it as kind of like a broom. They sweep the bottom of the ocean and all of the bottom dwelling fish and crustaceans will come off of the bottom, exposing themselves, and then the dolphins can come and eat those bottom dwelling animals. And mothers will show their calves, they'll show their daughters how to sponge. So this technique has spread throughout the local populations of dolphins off of Australia from this mother to daughter transmission. Here's another example. So Norway rats are pretty good at remembering the effects of what they eat. So if they eat a food that's poisonous, they will avoid that food for a long time. And the babies learn what to eat by watching what the adults eat and which types of food they avoid. So if they observe adults avoiding eating something, they will avoid it too, even when they're alone and they don't have that signal anymore. So they learn a lot of what to eat and what not to eat just by kind of copying the behavior of more experienced adult rats. So this was kind of a fun story too. So in the early 1920s in England, there was this type of bird called a blue tit, and there was a kind of genius bird that discovered, probably through trial and error learning, that they could open milk bottles that were sitting on porches. Basically, if they keep pecking the top of the milk bottle, they can burst through, and then basically they would just suck the cream off of the bottle. So the milk itself they couldn't digest, they're lactose intolerant, but the cream would sit on the top, and so they would suck up all the cream out of the bottle and then go and break more bottles. And other blue tits observed this behavior and they learned it through imitation. And over the next couple of decades, going into the 1930s and 1940s, this technique spread throughout England until basically all of the blue tits were kind of going after the cream of the milk bottles. So here's another case. So young wallabies are not innately fearful of specific predators. So they're not born with the ability to avoid specific predatory animals. they learn what to be afraid of by observing knowledgeable adults. So if they see adults reacting fearfully towards an animal, they will learn that that animal is dangerous. Okay, so we've talked a lot about different methods of learning. So now let's turn to a specific class of behaviors, which is orientation behaviors. You can think of behavioral traits as tools that animals use to solve problems that they encounter in the world. So throughout the life of an animal, they will experience a lot of problems, a lot of setbacks, and so they have specific behavioral tools that they can use to solve their problems. One common problem that most animals face is, how do you navigate around the world? So how do you find your way? How do you not get lost? So animals use their sensory organs to pick up on important cues. So they use sight, hearing, smell, electricity, magnetism to give them information that they can use to navigate. But that's just part of the answer. So they do use their senses, but how exactly do they use the information in their senses to orient and navigate their environment? So let's look at some different techniques that different animals use to orient themselves and navigate. So when we use the term orientation, we're specifically talking about the ability to judge where an animal is. So where do they fit into important features in the environment? So it's basically, if you had an internal map, being able to know where you are on that map is orientation. Then you have navigation. So a navigation ability is allowing you to move from one point to another. So at this, we're not just talking about knowing where you are, but actually being able to know how to go from point A to point B. So there are a lot of different ways that an organism can navigate their environment. So perhaps the simplest method of navigation is called random walk chemotaxis, and it's found in some species of bacteria. And I think it's kind of an interesting example of being able to solve kind of a complex problem with a very simple solution. So these bacteria are looking for food, and they can sense the concentration gradient of food where they are, but they can't sense the direction of food. So basically, if they're at a certain point in space, they can measure, okay, there's a lot of food particles where I am, or there's very little food particles where I am. But they can't tell what direction the food signals coming from. So where is the food source for these chemicals? So they follow this strategy to help them get to where the food is. When the concentration of food is low, they move in a random direction. So they randomly change their direction. It's called random walk. And when the concentration of food is high, they spin in place. So they basically kind of stay in the same position by just keep spinning. So by doing this, by carrying out the strategy of randomly moving, and then when they get to food spinning in place, the bacteria tend to cluster at food patches, even though they can't really move towards the direction of food. So here's some examples of random walk chemotaxis. So on the left here, this is a computer program simulating random walk. So this is giving you your starting point and your ending point over here on the left. So as you can see, the bacterial cell is just every few seconds, it's just changing its direction. So it's randomly changing its direction that it moves. So there's no kind of uniformity here as far as moving in a particular direction. But over time, because it keeps changing its direction, it'll like move throughout a pretty big piece of space. And if it ever arrives at a point where there's a lot of food there, then it'll switch to just spinning in place so it can digest the food that's available. So it'll look like this video here on the right. So it's kind of an ingenious way of getting to where the food is and digesting the food, but not actually having the ability to move in the direction of food. So if an organism can detect not just if there's food or not food, but if they can detect the direction of a stimulus, like what direction does food come from, or light, or sound, then they can move in the direction of the stimulus or opposite of the stimulus. So this is called taxis, and taxis can be positive or negative. So this is similar to that there was positive phototropism, negative phototropism, that plants can grow in a particular direction, but in the case of animals, we're talking about the body moving in the direction towards or away from a stimulus. So if you said an animal or an organism has positive phototaxis, that means that they move towards light. Negative chemotaxis would mean moving away from a specific chemical. So small organisms like some bacteria, they can achieve taxis, not by having paired sensory organs, which is what you would find in animals, a lot of animals, but by carrying out sequential calculations of some chemical's concentration. So this is kind of another ingenious way of figuring out the direction of something. So their strategy is basically to take a reading, move a little bit, take another reading. If the second reading is higher than the first, then they'll move straight because they know they're heading towards the food source. If the second reading is lower than the first, then they'll turn into a new direction. So this allows them to move towards or away from a source chemical. So they're kind of acting as if they have the ability to kind of focus in on the direction of a stimulus, even though they're actually not doing that. So for larger organisms, they carry out taxis behavior by having multiple sensory cells or organs, and then by comparing the strength of a signal in the two or more sensory structures, they can triangulate the source of the signal. And this is often why you have paired sensory organs. So we have two eyes, we have two ears, a lot of arthropods would have two or more antennas sticking out. In the case of the flatworms, they have two auricles that are chemoreceptors on the sides of their heads. So the reason why you have these paired sensory organs is that you can get two records, two recordings of how strong a signal is. So if you have two ears and you get a stronger stimulus in your left ear, like this sound is louder in your left ear, then you know the source of the sound is towards the left. So you can change the orientation of your head until you get the same volume in both ears, and then you know you're facing towards it. So this is a lot of times how animals will detect the direction, they'll triangulate the direction of a signal, is that they'll change their orientation until they get the same strength signal hitting their paired sensory structures. Yeah, so this is why having paired sensory organs is so common across animal groups. But for many animals, they do more than just moving towards or away from a certain stimulus. They can navigate a complex environment. So one common way that animals navigate is by remembering landmarks. Like they might remember, my home is next to the tall tree underneath the dark green shrub. And people do that too. In fact, I'm not particularly good at compass navigation, so I mostly rely on landmark navigation when I get around. So when you navigate the environment by using landmarks, that's called piloting. So if you're driving around town and well, to get to this place, I go to this particular store and turn left, you're using piloting. You're relying on landmarks to help you navigate. So landmarks are often used by animals when other navigational tools are impossible. Like ants have a lot of different tools. They usually orient using the position of the sun, but if it's a very cloudy day, then an ant may switch to piloting, using landmarks to help them navigate. So Namibian desert ants, they find their home burrows a lot faster if there's tiny landmarks near their home. Because usually they live in environments like sand dunes where there's not a lot of landmarks. So it's very difficult for them to know exactly where their burrow is by landmarks. They have to use, like the position of the sun or other navigational methods to find their way. In one study, scientists artificially added tiny landmarks near their burrows, and with the use of these landmarks, the ants found their homes faster. So a lot of times, some environments would be more conducive to using landmarks than other environments. So landmarks are only really useful when the environment is relatively stable. Like I mentioned before, if you're living in sand dunes, that might not be a great way to rely on landmarks. You have to be pretty good at being able to use landmarks in a case like that that's quite variable. Researchers were looking at a specific species of fish called three-spined sticklebacks, and they found that fish populations that lived in stable ponds where there's not this really strong water current, and so the vegetation and everything remains very stable, they relied on landmarks for navigation. While fish that lived in rivers that are more unstable, that because they have that massive flow of water, the vegetation doesn't stay as constant, the fish that lived in rivers did not rely on landmarks. So landmark navigation requires a pretty stable environment to be useful. So animals can also navigate using a geometric tool that works similarly to if you were reading a pirate treasure map, and this is called dead reckoning. So in dead reckoning, the way that the animal navigates, let's say that they leave their home and they go on a trip. They remember that the movements, the path that they took to get away from their home. And so they use that information of their movements to calculate the way back. This is also called path integration. And it's kind of a difficult mathematical skill to do this. So they think, starting from this point here, this little dot on the bottom, I went straight 4 steps. I went diagonal left 5 steps, hard left 2 steps, and then slightly left 10 steps. So this tells them how they got to their position. And so in order to find their way back home, they will use these movements, the direction and the distance of these movements to calculate the way back home. The distance to get back home as well as the direction. So they have to integrate all of these individual paths to figure out, okay, what is the total distance and direction back home. So this process of dead reckoning is used by many mammals, including rats and hamsters, although it tends not to be as reliable as other forms of navigation, because if you're off a little bit in your calculations, then you can arrive at a place that's pretty distant from your home base. A lot of ants can use dead reckoning in combination with other navigational tools. So it's especially important to desert ants. Like I mentioned before, if you're living in a very fluid desert where there's not a lot of landmarks, then these ants might have to rely a lot on dead reckoning. So they just go out on a trip and they're kind of keeping track of all of the movements that they take in order that they can find the most direct way to get back to their home colony. So this brings us to perhaps the most complex form of navigation, which is compass navigation. So in this case, an animal orients by considering the angle between itself and a fixed object. So it's as if you are using a compass that you're holding onto in order to navigate. So a lot of animals that migrate long distances, like salmon, pigeons, sea turtles, they appear to have a magnetic compass that's built into their bodies that orients towards the Earth's magnetic North Pole. And we don't know exactly how this happens. There's some evidence that the bird magnetic navigation could be in their eyes and use proteins that originally evolved for vision, but we don't really know exactly how it works in other animals. But there is a magnetic sense that attunes itself to the Earth's magnetic North Pole. And this is particularly useful for animals that travel really long distances. So a lot of different animals use the sun as a fixed point for compass navigation. The problem with using the sun is because the sun apparently moves across the sky due to the rotation of the Earth. So these animals have to account for the sun's movement by comparing the position of the sun to their internal clock. So they have to keep track of time, and they'll think to themselves, okay, I sense by my internal clock that it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so based on that, the sun should be in the direction of the southwest, so that helps them know the direction to get back home. So a lot of fish, insects, and reptiles have evolved to use the sun to help them navigate their environment. Honeybees have evolved a special type of language called a waggle dance, and they use this to communicate the location of food patches to the rest of the hive. So it tells other bees the distance towards food and the direction of the food, as well as what type of food is available there relative to the position of the sun. So it's a pretty complex symbolic language that they use when they dance communicate. So here's a little video showing you some of this waggle dance.
Honeybees have some fascinating abilities, among them being able to communicate by performing a unique dance. It informs hive mates where a newly discovered food source is located. Every cycle of this waggle dance roughly describes the shape of the figure 8. Let's rewind and look in more detail. The bee only waggles on a part of its route, the straight run, indicated here by the waved line. The secret lies in the direction of the straight run, or to be more precise, in the angle between the straight run and the perpendicular, which in this case is 90 degrees to the left. This tells the other bees that food is available 90 degrees to the left of the sun. If the angle is 60 degrees to the right, they'll be flying 60 degrees to the right of the sun.
So it's kind of a cool language that they have. When the bees are on a kind of a horizontal hive, so they can actually kind of dance in a horizontal direction, they'll just dance in the direction of the food source. But the problem is when they're on a vertical hive, so they're just facing up and down, they can't dance in the direction of the food. So what they do is they'll dance, compared to the vertical, whatever angle they dance will be the angle that the other bees have to go according to the angle between the sun and the food. And they even take into account the motion of the sun. So they'll adjust their angle based on the time of the day to let other bees know, okay, now this is the angle that you'll follow to get to the food. So animals that are active at night, nocturnal animals, they can't use the sun's position for navigation, but they can use the moon. So sandhoppers and dung beetles, two groups of insects, they use the moon for navigation, but the moon, again, isn't super reliable. It changes its position in the night sky. The pattern of stars in the sky is a lot more useful. The stars stay a lot more constant in their position relative to each other within the night sky. And so stars are used by various bird species, marine mammals like seals, as well as dung beetles also rely on stars as well. Okay. So one type of behavior that at first seems contrary to an evolutionary point of view is altruistic behavior. And this is where an individual undergoes some cost to themselves to benefit another individual. So an example would be a bee stings an animal threatening the hive, and as a result of stinging this individual, they die. Killdeer parents pretend to have an injured wing to draw predators away from their nest and eggs, making them more vulnerable to predators. So they will fake injury. Here's a little video showing you a killdeer parent pretending to have a broken wing. And you can see in this video, them kind of shaking that wing to draw attention to the fact that it's broken, although it's not really broken. then when vampire bats return to the roost, they will regurgitate blood for their best friends to eat if their best friends didn't have any luck that night finding food. So at first, when people hear about this type of altruistic behavior, they think of it that this is somehow contrary or disproves evolution by natural selection, because you have individuals kind of sacrificing themselves to benefit other individuals. But the more that you research it, the more you realize that this is not actually contrary to natural selection, and biologists would explain altruistic behavior in two different ways. The first way would be reciprocal altruism, and then the second explanation would be kin selection. So in reciprocal altruism, an individual commits an altruistic act to benefit another individual with the expectation that the other individual will help them later. So in the case of vampire bats that will regurgitate blood for their best friends, they are capable of recognizing and remembering individuals in their group, and they develop long-lasting friendships. So if bat A gives some of its food to bat B one night, bat B will repay it another night. Okay. And it's very important for the vampire bats to do this, because if they don't feed for a few nights in a row, they'll actually starve to death. So the benefit that they receive from having this close partnership with another bat outweighs any cost associated with sharing a little bit of blood when they're lucky. So both parties will benefit from this relationship. In the case of macaques, they take turns grooming each other. A lot of birds and mammals do this. Well, they will take turns grooming one another. They will both benefit from having parasites removed from their bodies. So reciprocal altruism is really kind of based on I scratch your back, you scratch mine. And when you do that, both parties benefit, because it's much easier to scratch someone else's back than to scratch your own back. So although they are committing altruistic behavior, it is to the selfish benefit of the individuals within the relationship to be part of this partnership. So the other explanation for altruistic behavior is kin selection. So in kin selection, an individual makes a sacrifice to benefit another individual, but they're not just some random stranger, they're a close relative. If you think about it, natural selection is about genes getting passed down from one generation to the next. You share many genes with your close relatives, including your children, your siblings, your parents. So by helping them, you are helping to pass on your own genes. And according to kind of modern evolutionary thinking, like the selfish gene theory, the proper scale of evolution is genes. So if genes manage to get themselves passed down by helping individuals that carry the same genes, then those genes will become more common in the population. They will be successful. So as kind of a thought exercise, let's imagine a population of squirrels. So some of these squirrels carry an allele of a gene, which I'm going to call H, that makes them helpful, where they will help their close relatives. They'll try to keep track of, who's related to whom, who their close relatives are, and other squirrels will carry a different allele for this gene, which I'm going to call S. They're not dominant or recessive in this case, so I'm just calling them, two different letters. And that makes them selfish, where they won't help anybody and only look out for themselves. So it doesn't matter who they're closely related to, they're only looking out for themselves. So we're going to start off with a population of like half of the squirrels are helpful, who help their close relatives, and half of them are kind of completely selfish. So helpful squirrels sometimes sacrifice themselves to help their relatives, who also will have a really high chance of carrying the H allele, the helpful allele. And because the H squirrels help each other, their average survival is higher than it is for the S squirrels, who are left to their own devices. You can think of it that on average, the benefit that an H squirrel receives from being helped is greater than the cost associated with helping another squirrel. So if this is like alarm calling, for example, the H squirrels will alarm call to each other if there's a predator nearby, and the S squirrels won't. They'll just keep silent. But the benefit received by these alarm calls is much greater than the cost associated with just making the alarm calls when they see a predator. So the overall survival for the helpful squirrels, the H squirrels, is much greater than this for the S squirrels. So over time, the helpful allele will spread throughout the population, until eventually you end up with the whole population of squirrels, which will all be helpful towards their close relatives. So this is in fact what you find in nature, that in a lot of cases, behavior that helps kin, including children, siblings, parents, that's favored by natural selection. So this kind of cooperative, altruistic behavior to help kin is actually increased by natural selection. So if we turn again to those bees, the bees that are stinging, attacking animals to protect the hive and dying in the process, those bees that are stinging are sterile. They are sacrificing themselves to protect the hive, including the queen. The queen is the only female bee in the hive that is fertile, that is capable of reproducing. And the workers are actually more closely related to the queen than even normal brothers and sisters would be, because of kind of a weird factor dealing with their genetics. So they are really closely related to the queen, and the queen is the only bee that can reproduce out of the whole hive. So when they sacrifice themselves for the queen, they are losing nothing, because if the queen dies, that's their only chance of passing on their genes. If the queen survives and they die, their genes get passed on. So in an evolutionary sense, they are being successful. They are increasing their fitness by sacrificing themselves for the queen. What you find for a lot of birds is that when birds first kind of reach puberty, are capable of reproducing, when they are kind of teenage birds that could reproduce, they often would not be super successful. They're not quite experienced enough or large enough to be able to, successfully reproduce at a high rate. So a lot of times these teenage birds don't actually leave, even though they could. They sacrifice their own mating season to stay at the nest and help raise their siblings, and they're called helpers at the nest. And it's thought that the benefit that they receive from helping their siblings, increasing the rate of their genes getting passed on through their siblings, that's a benefit to them than it would be to go out and try and reproduce and most likely not be successful when they're so young. Scientists have also found that ground squirrels alarm call more often when they're near close relatives than they are near more distant relatives. So they are constantly kind of aware of, okay, who's near me? If a predator shows up, am I going to alarm call or not? And if they're close to their siblings or, their parents, then they'll alarm call. But if they're close to their, second cousin Gary, then they might think, well, maybe I'll just remain silent this time and let Gary kind of, have as much luck as he can. So that brings us to the discussion activity, which I will post online to Canvas as an online assignment. So I want you to think about some questions related to animal behavior. So for the first question, I want you to come up with another example of classical conditioning and another example of operant conditioning that would involve wild animals. So I don't want you to think of this for pets. I want you to think about a situation in the wild. And different from any of the stories I came up with. So you really kind of have to understand the concepts and apply it to a new situation. So make sure you have one of each of those types of conditioning. For question 2, I gave you a few examples of genetically hardwired behavior in humans, which you could call instincts, especially in babies. Try to think of some other human behaviors that are genetically hardwired, that do not have to be learned. And then for question 3, this is a much more kind of theoretical question. So consider the fact that there are genetically hardwired behaviors in nature, and there are behaviors that have to be learned. So my question is, why have both of these? In what situations would having genetically hardwired behaviors be better? When would that evolve? And when would it be better for an organism to be capable of learning a specific behavior? So kind of what's the the benefit cost associated with these two types of behaviors. So think about that, and then I'll have another lecture hosted soon.